Hey everyone, welcome to our session with Uber Health's first ever Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Michael Cantor. I'm Scott Cohen from AGP Ventures in Boston. If you don't know AGP, we're an early stage venture fund that invests exclusively in Israeli startups. We're based in Boston and Tel Aviv, and our mission really is to connect Israeli founders to the US market. And one of the many ways we do that is by connecting Israeli entrepreneurs to executives in the U.S., like Dr. Cantor, that we have relationships with. We like to joke that just like Israeli founders have their networks, through Shmona Matayim and Talpiot and Sierra Matkal, we also have our networks. They're different networks, but they're with senior corporate executives in the U.S. who we've done business with and have known and trusted in some cases for decades. So we're honored to have one of those executives with us today, and my old friend, Dr. Michael Cantor. Mike is a geriatrician by training. He's served as chief medical officer of some of the most important care delivery organizations in the U.S. He's served as fractional chief medical officer for a number of companies, including Israeli companies like Intuition Robotics, and of course now Uber Health, where he's serving as their first ever chief medical officer. And just on a personal note, it's just worth saying that Mike is a fabulous mensch with an amazing family. He's been a supporter and advisor to AGP, and he's actually a huge friend of Israel. And in fact, he'll be back in Israel before the end of the week. So, Mike, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation. I'm joining you from New York, where I'm actually here with my colleagues from Uber for some on-site meetings. And part of what I'm going to be talking about with them is sort of what is this chief medical officer thing about? And so this is my the next several hours we're talking about myself, which is kind of awkward, but I think there's a really important set of things to think about when considering how to engage with healthcare organizations, and understanding how to work with chief medical officers and medical directors is an important aspect of that.
Oh, awesome. All right. I can't wait to get into it. So, hey folks, so I'm going to kick off a few questions to Dr. Cantor, but we're here to get your questions answered, not mine. So pose any questions in the comments field and we'll get them answered as we go. So, Mike, maybe we just start at the basics. What actually is Uber Health?
Sure. So Uber Health is a wholly owned subsidiary of Uber Technology, which is the rideshare company that everyone's familiar with. It started about 4 or 5 years ago, basically to solve a transportation problem that hospitals had. So it's Friday afternoon, you're trying to get your patients home so you can admit new people, for example, and you have taxi vouchers, you may have a local contract, but there was no sort of centralized, technologically advanced, sophisticated way to figure out how to get patients home safely. And not people, obviously, in the ambulances or wheelchairs or things, accessible vans or things like that. So that was the birth of it. And I've been working with Uber now for a little bit over a year. And what we've done since that time is expanded to several thousand customers across the United States. We've launched our first partnerships in Australia. We're looking at several markets in Europe now as well. And we're looking to actually do more than just provide transportation. Our goal is to be able to try to provide sort of a one-stop shop, a platform where people can go to get transportation, so ride shares. But not only that, so if they need a wheelchair accessible van, if they need an ambulette, if they need a more advanced form of non-emergency medical transportation, so not like emergency ambulances, but every other kind of medical transportation, you can go to one place and order all of those things. Instead of having to go to Uber to order rideshare, go somewhere else to get the wheelchair accessible van, we're actually now partnering with an organization here in the US, starting piloting, so one-stop shop for all forms of non-emergency medical transportation. And soon we'll be going live with some pilots for 2 important advances. One is prescription delivery. So being able to actually deliver prescriptions to patients' homes in a very easy, straightforward way from the same platform where you're ordering rides, if that's what you're working on. And secondly, we're adding food. There's a whole food is medicine movement. And so through Uber Eats, we have the opportunity to provide a curated experience where people can go to certain restaurants that have food delivered, or they can go to the grocery store and order groceries and we'll deliver that to them as well. What's different about this is we're actually tying it to a link with the health plan. So we'll have eligibility and benefits embedded in that. So you'll know Mike has 12 rides a year. He's used 10. So he only has 2 left to get back and forth to see Dr. Cohen. Great. We can set that up, no problem, and arrange in advance and all of that. Mike also has, and we're thinking about interesting clinical use cases. So for the patient coming out of the hospital, sort of the birth of Uber Health, right? What if we could provide the ride home and the ride back within a few days to see their primary care doctor or specialist who's following them after the hospitalization, and make sure that the right medications are delivered to that person within a few hours of their arrival at home? And because they have, through the Medicare Advantage plan, they have post-discharge meal benefits, let's make sure that healthy meals are being delivered to them, or groceries are being delivered to them as well. And so you can see we're having sort of a centralized place using the Uber Health platform we're all familiar with from carrying around in our pockets on our smartphones. Really being able to do that in a single place is going to make all of this much easier and more accessible. Additionally, it's set up today so that the patients don't have to have a smartphone. They don't have to have an Uber app. They don't have to have a credit card. All of this can be managed through a care coordinator who's working for a provider organization or a health plan. So we'll be able to actually empower patients to do it themselves in the future. But today we can actually have other people, if they prefer, set it up for them and coordinate it for them. And because it's the Uber Health, Uber technology, if you're in clinic and there's a patient coming to see you that's using an Uber Health ride, you can actually see in real time, just like when you share your Uber ride with someone, where is that patient? Are they late? What else is going on? Did they miss their ride? So now we have to book another one for them. You can see all of that in real time, and it can all be centrally billed, tracked, managed, reported back to the entity who's paying for it, so they can actually understand how they're spending their transportation dollars or food dollars or prescription delivery dollars as well. And looking to the future, the idea is we keep adding more to the platform. So in the future, for example, there could be over-the-counter benefits from the front of a pharmacy can be delivered as well as a prescription. Maybe it's diagnostic testing. So you don't have a COVID test at home, you're not feeling well, we can deliver that. I mean, Uber Health can move people or it can move things. And so the beauty is you can begin to mix and match sort of what is it that you need, when do you need it, if it's urgent, how do we facilitate that? And we're looking at prescription delivery, for example, that's sort of store agnostic. So if it's the local hospital pharmacy, or if it's CVS or Walgreens or Rite Aid or Walmart, one of the big chains, we can do all of that. So it's really helping to allow for benefit design for health plans. And I just got off a call just a little while ago with a very prominent Medicare Advantage plan. They're going to start offering this as a benefit, we think, for next year. So we're in discussions with a lot of health plans about structuring benefits to incorporate prescription delivery and food as medicine. If they already have a food as medicine program, we can enable that. And we're talking to provider organizations all the time about how do we make it easier for them to do their work and coordinate all these complicated, patients and their various needs. And we're talking to even health systems who are, for example, we work with home health agencies to provide rides for their workers in the community so that they don't have to rely on their own cars. Or if they're in a city, like I'm talking to you from Manhattan, parking here is not easy or cheap. It's much cheaper to have a driver literally take you from point to point than to struggle to find a place to park and to pay for it and all the rest of it. So Uber Health is in good shape. We've had significant growth over the last year, and the future looks even better.
Wow, that's amazing. So I've got a bunch of follow-up questions, and some have come in already. But I just want to ask about the role. Like, you're their first ever chief medical officer. Like, it sounds like you're going to be talking about that later today. But what does that actually mean?
So today, what it means is that I do a lot of different things for them, depending on what their needs are. In fact, this is the presentation. I'm going to go back and talk to my colleagues about it. It's interesting. Chief medical officers and medical directors come in different flavors, depending on the nature of the organization they're working with. For a company like Uber Health, where you have clients who are health plans, you have clients who are provider systems, you have employers also now part of the Uber Health sort of verticals that we sell into. You need to have an externally facing medical director often, or chief medical officer. So a lot of what I do is work with potential clients and current clients. So talking to health plans about what we can do for them, talking to employer, brokers sometimes, not the transportation brokers, but benefits brokers, about how Uber Health fits in the solutions for employers. So business development support more generally. So really helping them think through kind of who should we be talking with? Who do I know that I can help them with? Being part of sales conversations. Once a sale occurs, helping with account management. So if there are issues, making sure that those are being addressed, and being sort of the clinical liaison for Uber Health to these organizations. The sale to health plans, whether it's Uber Health or another organization, often involves sort of multiple audiences at the same time. There's usually a clinical audience, which is the chief medical officer, the medical director, or maybe director of nursing. There's business, the CEO or the CFO and their direct reports thinking about the business, what's this going to cost and how do we save money and all the rest of it. And there's usually sort of either network or vendor management or procurement or IT. And what's important is that when you're pitching to health plans or provider organizations, very similar as well, you need to have the voice of the clinical experience and expertise to answer the clinical questions. You need to have the business folks there to answer business questions. You need to have the IT team and vendor manager, all of that. And so a lot of what I do is help to translate the services and products that the organizations I work for into clinical speak to work with clinicians, or into business speak to talk to their business executives. And I've been really lucky to work in a variety of different organizations, health plans, like you mentioned. I worked at Bright Health as their chief medical officer for about a year. I've worked as a medical director at Evercare, which is now part of Optum, which is United. I've worked for health systems like Tufts Medical Center in Boston, helping run their physician network with 1,800 doctors and 150,000 managed care lives, understanding what you need to do to improve quality, save costs, and succeed in those contracts. Also work with companies like CareCentrix that manage post-acute care benefits and are more in the vendor space, and with a number of digital health startups like Intuition Robotics. So really have a lot of experience working as the sort of liaison between those organizations, but also helping think through for the organization, what's the product strategy from a clinical perspective? And even more importantly, what's the product market fit? Because unfortunately, lots of organizations have great ideas that can make healthcare better. But if the market isn't ready to pay for those, or doesn't see the value, or both, it doesn't really matter. And so part of what I do is help to translate clinical needs from a market perspective into product strategy, work with the operations team, work internally as well as externally to help them figure out what they need to do. So for Uber Health, I'm working on, as mentioned, calls with health plans, but I'm also talking to them about, so we're setting up a new product, food is medicine, food delivery. Well, how do we know that it's healthy food? What do we mean by healthy food? How do we think through the health implications of making sure that if someone is diabetic, that they have food that's going to keep them healthy, which is different than a kidney patient or a cancer patient. So answering those sort of clinical questions that come up in the context of a healthcare related business, that's also part of what I do and what chief medical officers and medical directors are doing all over the world every day, in terms of making sure that the most important person in all of this is never forgotten, and that's the patient. So always making sure that we're advocating for the patient and often their families and communities to ensure that at the end of the day, they're getting better health, better quality, lower cost, better experience. That's really what the ultimate role of the chief medical officer and the medical director is about. It's being that patient advocate and balancing sometimes the business needs and the operational needs and the clinical needs to make sure we're ultimately helping people, get healthy, stay healthy.
Totally makes sense. So look, that was great context. Thank you. I wonder if we can zoom out to maybe 60,000 feet. This is, as you know, the audience for this is largely Israeli startups, a lot of them in the healthcare space, obviously. And I think there's a lack of appreciation for the complexity of the US health market. In Israel, there's basically 4 HMOs. In the US, it's a completely different game. And I would love if you can kind of explain what's happening in the US that is driving Uber Health. In other words, kind of the revolution and kind of making, you and I have talked about this in the past, of driving care closer to the home and away from the hospitals is part of a major kind of evolution, if not transformation, happening in the US. And I wonder if you can kind of set the stage for some of the people listening, just kind of what's happening, because I assume that's kind of what's driving Uber Health strategy.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of it, is instead of thinking about how do we bring patients to care, which Uber Health does sometimes, how do we make it easier for them to access it in the community or at home ultimately? And as you know, I'm biased in all of this. So I'm a geriatrician, a lot of experience taking care of older adults. I still make house calls one day a month. So I still get to see a couple of patients at home every month, which reminds me the value of what we do and why it's so important to bring care to the home. What happened during COVID is that there was sort of a recognition that we could provide some care via telehealth or virtual care instead of having to do it in person. And that led to lots of virtual visits and lots of prediction that this will be the way of taking care of patients. Well, now that the pandemic is, whatever you want to call it, sort of better managed, better controlled, less of a risk, we're still seeing some virtual visits, but it's not quite as the level as it could be. And so I think we'll still see slow growth in that over time. What we are seeing, at least in my neighborhood, in your neighborhood, Scott, in Boston, in Massachusetts, is that hospitals are overwhelmed. They just don't have enough beds. They don't have enough staff. They don't just to open the beds that they need. And so there's growing recognition that the better place to take care of people is away from hospitals, away from nursing homes, to help people in the community, especially for older adults. Many of them want to age in place and stay where they are and not move to nursing home or assisted living or whatever. And so the extent that we can do that, we should do that because it's what they want, it's what they need. And in many cases, it's a higher quality and lower cost. So we're seeing, for example, hospital at home. What that means is instead of being admitted to the hospital, people are taken care of at home. And it's very protocol driven. So you have to be stable, you have to have certain conditions. Interestingly, when I was a geriatrics fellow a million years ago, I went to Israel for a month. And one of the things I saw were hospital at home models being run out of Hadassah Hospital in Mount Scopus. And so these ideas may sound new to us in the US, but the reality is around the world, and even in Israel, we've had examples of where sort of home-based community models of care have not only been implemented, but have thrived and they're showing excellent results and have grown because of that. So I think the recognition that healthcare starts at home and ends at home is what's creating a lot of need for logistical support to move people to see people at home, to provide the medications. You can imagine a future where we wake up with a sore throat, and instead of going to see a doctor for a strep throat, someday we'll have FDA approval in the US for home strep tests like we have for COVID tests. You'll have the home strep test delivered, or maybe you already have it. It's positive. You'll have a video visit with a clinician who will ask you a series of questions, make sure it's safe for you to be treated at home. They'll order the penicillin if you're not allergic to that, or whatever antibiotic, send it to your house. You'll never have to leave your home to be treated for something as straightforward as a strep throat or an influenza or whatever. And that's better, not only in terms of convenience for the patient and access to care, it also keeps other people from being exposed to strep throat or COVID or flu or whatever by having to go to urgent care or to your doctor or to emergency room. So really the logistical needs are where Uber Health is growing, but the whole healthcare industry, like I said, there's been a lot of regression to the mean in terms of delivering more in-person care. But now that the door is open and we can see that this can be done feasibly, I think we'll see sustained and steady growth, even if it's a little bit slower than it was during the pandemic. We'll see this continue. And I think the other reality is people are going to demand it. Once you've been treated at home, you didn't have to go through the wonderful experience of driving to the hospital and paying to park it while you're in the ER and being admitted or sent home and after a 6-hour wait or whatever. I think people are going to expect in the future that this is going to be available to them. At least I hope so. And our system should be able to deliver that for them.
We've seen some research that show that some of the major retail players that people don't normally associate with healthcare, like the Walmarts of the world that have a footprint and thousands of retail locations across the U.S., often in rural areas where there isn't a hospital, are actually to play an outsized role in healthcare delivery over the next 20 or so years. Do you guys share that kind of philosophy or program? What are your thoughts on how other people are entering the market?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve healthcare in the U.S. No question about that. The hard part is to be able to do it consistently, at scale, in an affordable way that delivers better results. And so the beauty of Uber is that Uber is everywhere. And so not quite. I mean, there's certain areas like rural areas where it's a little bit less available. But in terms of its scale, it's hard to come up with another organization that can deliver it the same way. It's similar. It's why you see Walmart or Walgreens or CVS, national pharmacy chains, moving more into direct care provision, in addition to providing pharmacy services or groceries or everything Walmart sells. So I think you're right. We're going to see this continue as we recognize that access to healthcare is so important. And in the United States, we do face serious problems with disparities in access and disparities in care. So there are a lot of communities that you mentioned, rural communities, but also urban communities, surprisingly, where you can be in the middle of the city, but you can't access healthcare because you don't have the right insurance, or you don't know it's there, or it's not open at the times you can go get to it. So being able to leverage stores that are open more than just 9 to 5, like a typical doctor's office, or 8 to 5, that's where I think we'll see more community access points coming from a variety of different retail players, and also from others who are able to, again, like Uber, move people or move things to make access to healthcare better, especially when combined with digital outreach and virtual visits.
Can we, first of all, just a reminder to everyone who's watching that there's a comment field here. You can ask questions, and we'll make sure we can pose them to Dr. Cantor. Mike, like, can we just want to rewind at the beginning? You kind of talked about how you guys were doing some pilots, and I'm curious, like, how does Uber think about pilots? And obviously, the context here is Israeli startups are always trying to figure out, like, how do they do pilots with hospital systems, with providers, with payers, with the Uber Health of the world? Like, how do you guys think about pilots, both with like the pilots you're doing with the healthcare providers or the payers, and the way that kind of early stage companies may or may not be able to plug into what you're doing?
So I think that the challenge is that there are so many point solutions now that pilots become almost a dirty word. It's kind of like if you go to a health plan or a health system and say, look, I've got a great app that can solve your problems for fill in the blank, diabetes, high blood pressure, whatever, eyes roll. People are not interested because they've tried this and it hasn't worked. Even if you actually do have an app that's really valuable and does work, where you have data, where you have all those things, it's a little bit different for Uber. These are more like proof of concept before we scale. So it's kind of like we just need to do these pilots to work out the bugs, and then we're going to grow because they're going to write a benefit for a health plan, for example, or they already have a benefit, and we're going to be the contractor that's providing the rides or the access to meals or whatever as part of a benefit design that they already have in place. For newer companies, and I'm a part-time chief medical officer for Uber and part-time for other companies, as you know. So I'm constantly talking with my other clients about how do we start pilots, how do we get these relationships put in place. Having a pilot strategy is really important, and finding that first pilot partner is really, really critical. And remembering that most of the folks that you want to sell to are also being bombarded with requests for, can I talk to you about this? Can we work on a pilot together? So figuring out how to make it easier for them. So what is it that they need? What's your value proposition as the innovative organization? How do you, in the easiest, lightest way possible in terms of implementation time and data gathering and all the rest of it, get what you need to show that you have value and they're adding value? Be prepared to invest in the pilots. I think doing paid pilots is the best thing you can do, of course, from the perspective of the new organization. But don't be surprised if people, especially right now, healthcare systems are losing tons of money in the United States. They're not in a position to take their scarce budget dollars and invest in innovation. And if they were last year, this is a different year. So really thinking about as you budget to start up a new company, budgeting for pilots. And so it's really free or low cost. I mean, if you can convince people to pay for pilot, great. Don't get me wrong. But really thinking about how do you make it easier, cheaper, faster for that organization. The couple of mistakes that I see are pretty common is, thinking that the innovative company is the center of the world, when in fact it's that hospital or their potential client who is. So you have to see it from their perspective. You have to see the value proposition, not just this is going to allow me to grow my company, but what problem am I solving for them? As I mentioned earlier, sort of the product market fit. What problem am I solving, and are they willing to pay for it? And is the pilot not just, this is really fun and now we learn we can help you, but making sure that before the end of the pilot, you're making a go, no-go decision, which is hopefully go, that they're going to agree to scale and expand it if certain criteria are met. So building that into the pilot so it becomes an entree to a much longer term, broader contract is a really important part of the strategy as well. Having the right measurements, having agreement about what those measurements are, how much of a difference is a real difference, all of those things should also be worked out in advance. Those can be somewhat challenging or complicated negotiations. And so sometimes I've recommended that we just, agree that we'll sign the contract now and get things started. And we'll come to agreement between the analytical team for the organization and the client side, or the customer side with the company, so that you don't hold up the negotiation process over agreeing on what the measures of success are going to be. Otherwise, you can get delayed for months by actuaries and analysts, and that's not going to be helpful or productive.
That's really interesting, and absolutely kind of resonates with me. Can you talk about if you've noticed a difference, because you've now played in the U.S. space? I know you played in the Israeli space. I'm curious are there certain things that the Israeli startup community has done better, faster, cheaper, or is better at than some of the things you've seen at the US? Like, what is there something kind of special and magical in Israel? And I'm not speaking specifically about intuition robotics, but like other companies you've seen and have paid attention to, like what's different about Israel that you're seeing?
I think what's different about Israel is just the sheer volume of new ideas and the ability to take ideas and turn them into concrete products, which are then can then be operationalized and scaled. Usually, and the recognition of the importance of data to have those proof points, even if they're small early proof points, the recognition that that's part of the way companies have to grow. So I think there's an expectation on the Israeli side that there will be data, there will be a need for proving value. There is a relatively short runway. The time pressure, I think we all feel in the startup world, or even early stage companies, or even growth companies at more advanced phases, we all feel that time pressure. And I think the Israeli sort of ecosystem is really keyed into understanding what are those metrics for success? How do I get them as quickly as possible? What's the value of paying for that? So I see companies like Intuition making investments to make sure that they've got the product right and that they have the right partners to invest with to ensure ongoing growth of their company and of those products over time. So I feel like it's sort of the entrepreneurial spirit, we know we're going to run into a lot of roadblocks, but that's not going to stop us. We're just going to keep going. I think that's where the Israeli companies, with that persistence, that sense of urgency, and the technological sophistication, I think is really, those are the key areas where they have an edge over other startups or innovative companies.
And have you seen other, not just in Israel, in the US, is there competition that's thinking about kind of delivery of care the same way Uber Health is? I mean, like who else is in the space and thinking about this?
Yeah, so we obviously, Uber competes head to head with Lyft.
Right.
So that's an obvious competitor. They do have a healthcare division. I'm not very familiar with it, but they do have that. There also are other companies, transportation brokers, that have networks of non-emergency medical transportation providers. And so we are their partners in most cases because they're using Uber to provide rideshare as part of their continuum of transportation benefits. So I think they're just sort of co-opetition because we really partner with them more than we compete with them.
Right.
I think the really interesting question is, what does it mean to be a healthcare platform? And is that competition, or is it really a chance to actually connect the dots? And so I see it more as the latter, that the more one comprehensive platform where I can get transportation, food, medication delivered, maybe a video visit, maybe durable medical equipment delivery, and ordering, all of those things in one place. Am I going to compete with a durable medical equipment vendor as Uber Health? No. Is every durable medical equipment vendor going to be on my platform? Probably not. So it's not really competition as much as, there's a lot of discussion about the digital front door, which is fine. Like, how do you access these platforms? More important, in my opinion, is what's behind the front door. So what network are you connecting with to access whatever the services that that patient or that person or their family might need in real time or in the near future? Who do they go to for urgent care? Who do they go to get their prescriptions from? Who are they going to get their food if it's a medically tailored meal? Thinking about who's behind that door and thinking more about the networks is really important, because platforms are only as good as the networks behind them and the services and the products you can access through that platform. And so this whole issue, everyone talks about curated, carefully selected. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true. But any organization that's going to rely on others to actually deliver the services and not deliver it themselves needs to pay attention to networks. That's one of the things that I've learned over the years that I never really thought I'd worry so much about. It's really, really important who your partners are, who's in that network, whether it's who's driving for Uber or who is running the platform that you're connected with to provide the meal. All of those things really, really matter. And oftentimes they're not thought about up front. It's oh yeah, we'll figure it out when we get there. You've got to really make sure that those things, if you're working in a networked environment, that you paid attention to that, because the ultimate quality of experience and the product rests on the quality of the network.
Can you? I'm not sure if you're prepared to answer this question or if you can, but I'm going to pose it because we got it from one of our audience members asking about metrics. So I'm just rewinding a little bit. They were said that when you were talking about how Israeli startups can think about entering the U.S. market and piloting, you said, well, like you should know how you're going to measure success. And the question is like, how is Uber Health thinking about measuring success of its own programs and pilots? Have you guys put thought to that, or is that something you could even talk about right now?
Sure. So I think, at a high level, there are a number of metrics that are pretty common. And I always think about metrics in terms of sort of three buckets. So there are process measures, outcomes measures, and experience measures in healthcare, right? So if my value proposition to a potential client is I'm going to save you money, that's an outcomes measure, right? So if I'm going to reduce hospitalizations, let's say, which translates into dollars saved, the number of admissions you need to reduce has to be significant. It has to be measured the same way. You have to have claims data. You have to think about all of the intricacies of measuring hospitalizations in order to show that the rate, which is not even a direct measure, it's almost like you're counting something that didn't happen. So it's always problematic. So I would not go into a short-term pilot thinking I'm going to reduce admissions. It's just too complicated and hard. It takes more time and greater numbers to actually show a meaningful difference. If I want to show, the first step of value always includes, from population health perspective, it's always, stratify the population, figure out who's going to be targeted, engage that population, deliver your intervention, measure the results, rinse and repeat. So when you think about the engagement piece, that's where almost every healthcare company of whatever kind struggles. So the health plans are struggling to get their members to pay attention to the messages that they're sending. The provider organizations aren't always having people show up. So part of your value proposition is we're successfully engaging patients. Well, that's something I can count. Like how many visits, how many times are they on the app? How many units of whatever service I'm providing did they use? So having process measures along the way and counting, like if we make 100 phone calls, how many of those phone calls were answered? How many of those phone calls where they were answered turned into someone engaging in the program? If someone engaged in the program, how many of them completed the program, right? So thinking through each step of the way of that process, measuring what those steps are and showing that people are engaging, are valuing it, even better, are returning to use it again and again. If it's a product or a program that's more chronic in nature rather than sort of one-off, those are the kinds of process measures that matter. And then the third piece, so process, outcomes, and experience is what was it like for the patient? Did they feel it was better because they engaged with that product? Did they feel like they were heard better by their clinicians? So asking always, what was your experience? What could we have done better? In measuring that and using those measurements to influence how you're delivering the product or the service, really, really important data that needs to be gathered. And not just from the patients, could be from their family members as well, also from the providers. So if you're working on a chronic illness and making up this example, you're going to improve diabetes care. Well, that's great if the patient feels better, but if their doctor doesn't have a clue who these people are calling their patients and telling them to do something different than the care plan that they just laid out, the long-term success of that intervention is highly, highly doubtful. So making sure that you're measuring the engagement with the providers and their experience of that engagement, also really important, potentially more difficult and more time consuming. But if the clinicians who are using this service indirectly because their patients are using it, if they don't like it, the patients aren't going to like it either. So always important to think about experience from the patient and family's perspective, but also the providers.
Got it. So I've got a bunch of questions here I want to kind of pose to you in kind of random order here. One is, we hear all the time that like HIPAA security and compliance are often used as like crutches for organizations to explain why they can't do something. And I'm curious whether your experience with providers, this question is around like, whether your partners are at all concerned about, if this has come up, security, HIPAA, privacy around when you've got potentially drivers delivering, prescriptions, pharmaceuticals, whatever. Like what? Tell us about that. Is that an issue? How do you guys think about driver clearance? Like what's that? What does that mean for you guys?
Yeah, so what it means today is that we've shied away from working with drivers and telling them this is an Uber Health ride. They may notice that they're picking someone up in a hospital or dropping them off at a doctor's office, but we're not telling them today that it's Uber Health because of concerns about HIPAA and confidentiality. We're working with our legal team to see how we might adjust that expectation, because there are exceptions to HIPAA for operations, for quality improvement, and for providing better care. And so there are some exceptions that we're working on. And there are other examples from other industries where, from home health aides, for example, they don't necessarily have to have a BAA with the business associate agreement to be a home health aide to know that they're delivering it as a contractor for an organization, right? So because Uber drivers are contractors, not employees, we need to think through kind of how that works. And we're working on that. If you are an innovative startup that wants to work in the United States, you must be prepared to pass security audits. So initially so every client that I've ever worked with that's going to start working with an provider organization or whoever, they better be able to answer that security questionnaire and to demonstrate the security of their systems to handle what we call personal health information, or PHI, which is protected under the law of HIPAA, which is a federal rule. In the United States, we have 51 jurisdictions. We have 50 states, plus District of Columbia, which is its own jurisdiction. Each state has its own set of rules and separate security and privacy rules that are superimposed on top of the federal rules. It's kind of, the security guy I used to work with said, it's kind of like a stack of pancakes. They're all kind of misshapen. You stab your fork in, some's federal, some state. For example, in Massachusetts, I always, when I go to see patients, have to get their permission to talk about confidential information. There are special questions I must ask about information related to HIV and AIDS, behavioral health issues, and substance use disorders. If they don't specifically opt into sharing information about that, I'm not allowed to ask them about that or to share that information if they tell me about it with anyone else. And that's a state law. So there are specifics that you have to know about, that you have to, unfortunately pay a lot of lawyers to help you sort through, but it's worth that investment, because if you don't have the security piece, which is not my area of expertise, I just know enough to know you better have that down, and the confidentiality and privacy piece, you're going to be unable to work in the US market. And it's legit. I mean, if you're a healthcare organization and somehow, all of a sudden people find out that you're delivering people to a methadone clinic and you didn't intend that to be public, they are not going to want to work with you anymore. So that's it. These are real world serious problems that deserve a lot of attention and investment. It can be frustrating because of the legalistic way the United States tends to do things, but they're really legitimate reasons and concerns that drive the need for privacy and for security of the data. And there have been a lot of famous breaches that have resulted in some real problems. So that's why it's so important. I would also say that if you're going to be an organization that wants to provide clinical care directly, so you want to do virtual visits and you want to see people in Ohio and Missouri and Kansas and Massachusetts and New York and California, and you have licensed clinicians in those states, you better also think about the corporate practice of medicine. Because in the United States, you can't have doctors who are working for a company and delivering clinical care. They have to have their own professional corporations. There's a whole business, I'm convinced, of just setting up these professional corporations so that every state can have operations in every state. But it's another regulatory area that many people wouldn't think about before coming into the US that's really important to consider. And it's quite expensive, unfortunately. So I've even had clients that have changed their entire operating model to avoid having licensed clinicians working across state lines, because it was prohibitively expensive to set up the legal infrastructure and then the credentialing and all the other things you have to do to maintain it over time. So be wary not just of security and privacy, but all of the sort of credentialing and the state laws about corporate practice of medicine. Those are things you have to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, that's great guidance. Mike, I've got a couple of questions kind of that I put in like the organizational structure bucket. One is kind of like as you guys think about Uber Health, do you have like your own kind of carved out like development team? Has the product required kind of customization? Are those Uber people? Are they Uber Health people? Like, how do you guys think about it in terms of just the organization?
Yeah, so I think you have to have people who are used to working within the healthcare environment in the US, which is its own. We just talked about some regulatory specific issues in terms of privacy, confidentiality, how medical practice is organized. The issue with healthcare, and it's true regardless of what country you're working in, is that it has to be high precision, right? So if you say I need a ride to the hospital and you drop me off at the wrong hospital, that's a bit more of a problem than if you've ordered a pizza and the pizza ends up at the wrong address. So understanding sort of that level of precision and why it has to be not just delivered to, I'll make it up, Brigham and Women's Hospital, but Brigham and Women's Hospital Internal Medicine Clinic located on the east side of this street. That's really, really important, because if that person has a hard time walking, even a rideshare person can, walk, but if they're all the way on the other side of the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is a massive institution in Boston, that's a problem. So the first thing is the product team, the development team really needs to understand that level of precision, and why what seems like not a big deal, and which may not be a big deal in other areas, is sort of a deal breaker, because that only has to happen a couple of times. And your clients will call you and say, you know what, we're not interested. Health plans, they get what's called complaints to Medicare, or CTMs, Medicare Advantage plans. If they get more than a certain number of those, it costs them a lot of money and time and energy dealing with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That's the last thing they want to be doing. And so that level of precision is really important for product teams to understand. It's also important for product teams to understand how healthcare works in the United States, that there is no like centralized protocol driven way that we take care of patients with, fill in the blank, heart failure. So there isn't like one common protocol. Every clinic is a little bit different. Every patient's a little bit different. And so understanding that the customers for Uber Health, for example, the customers are the health plans or the provider organizations, but the doctors, their teams, the care coordinators are also really important customers for Uber Health. And so are the patients and their family members. And so it isn't enough to only think about who's paying for it as the customer. You've got to always put the patient first and foremost, and the provider a very close second, because if you don't think about how to make it better for them to use your service, whether them as the patient or the provider, they're not going to use it. It only takes one or two bad experiences. Doctors are a little judgmental. I don't know if you know this, Scott, but sometimes they tend to form strong opinions pretty hastily. So if they have a bad experience with an Uber Health ride, it's going to take a lot to overcome that. And so you'd better be careful and think about the implications of what you are doing, regardless of what company you're with. How does it affect the clinicians whose patients are going to be using this service? And from the patient perspective, how does it make things better, easier, cheaper, and a better experience for them? Otherwise, even if it's great for the health plan and reducing costs, but no one's going to use it because they hated the experience, that's a real problem.
So does that imply that you guys are building your own like expert healthcare IT kind of team to help kind of develop any products that spin out of or become part of Uber Health?
I'm sorry, Scott, can you hold just a second? I apologize. 1 second.
No problem. While Mike's dealing with, just a reminder, you're talking to Dr. Michael Cantor of Uber Health, and you can ask questions using the comment field. Anyway, I was asking, like, just based on that answer, does that mean you guys have built your own or are building your own kind of team to build product for Uber Health?
Yes, because it's a specialized enough area. And once you have the platform, you can borrow pieces of it. So you can use an Uber Eats platform, for example, to deliver groceries or deliver meals. But how do you know how many meals the health plan covers? That requires understanding benefit design, the fact that not only is it that vary by health plan, so what United Health does is different than what Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts does. But within what Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts offers are dozens of plan designs, benefit designs with different levels of transportation or medical costs and cost sharing and all the rest of it. So you have to be able to understand that sophisticated healthcare specific information. And that's why it's helpful to have a product team that understands it. And I actually work with our product team and help educate them about what are those challenges to make it easier for them to design products which are actually going to be acceptable and accepted by not just the payers and providers, but by the patients and the people who are working with them.
Got it. So a second kind of maybe unrelated organizational question is around kind of any kind of overlap with other functions within Uber, like Uber Eats. Like, you're not chief medical officer for Uber Eats or anything like that. Is there any kind of overlay between different products?
Yeah, so there's constant, because it is one company. So yes, we are talking about how people are we're relying not just on the product team for Uber Health, but Uber Health is part of this much larger product development team. Uber has over 25,000 employees around the world, and so we are part of that much larger ecosystem. So, for example, the IT architecture is not going to be determined by Uber Health. Uber Health is part of what's called Uber for Business. Uber for Business is including not just Uber Health, but also Uber Eats and Uber Transportation and Uber for Business, like employee benefits, like you want to give your employees Uber Eats vouchers so they can eat meals and stay on campus longer, or they love your company and don't want to quit and work somewhere else. There are all those things that Uber does as well. And so there's kind of an overlap there. There isn't really much of a role for me today outside of Uber Health, because most of what I'm working on is sort of helping the product team think through what we need to do within healthcare, and working as an external liaison with healthcare related organizations, health plans, providers, and the employee benefits folks within employers.
Great. Look, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. This one, I'm not sure if this is tongue in cheek or not, but they're asking, could Uber Ambulance be a reality in the next 5 to 10 years?
I guess it could be. I think in the way we're approaching Uber Health is we're looking for partnerships. So, for example, we're not going to become a prescription delivery organization where every Uber driver is delivering prescriptions, because they're really serious regulatory requirements that are important in terms of ensuring safety of those medications, especially controlled substances. So, no, we're probably not going to see Uber Ambulance as part of reality in the next 5 to 10 years. But could it be that there's a link between the non-emergency medical transportation platform that we currently offer and emergency medical transportation? Potentially. I think it's unlikely, because all healthcare is local and emergency medicine is really, really local. And so probably not going to be connected, but one never knows how things are going to continue to evolve and change in the healthcare system. And I think more likely is we'll see more people using Uber to get their urgent care providers to make house calls, or we'll see being able to use non-emergency medical transportation if someone really isn't that sick. So the ambulance arrives, realizes they don't need to be transported urgently, but we can book a ride for them with the lower level of transportation. Maybe that happens. So I can see sort of that kind of alignment, but I don't see Uber Ambulance taking off anytime in the near future.
So all right, I've got a bunch of questions here about things that I would bucket into like the emerging technology category. Like, what does Mike think about AI and machine learning and blockchain? So let me just like bucket these together and ask, like, are there certain technologies or capabilities that you personally or that Uber Health is kind of thinking about, interested in, tracking? Like, what are the things that are kind of like the emerging technologies that are of interest to you?
Yeah, and again, I work with Uber, but I also work with other clients too. So these topics come up all the time in a variety of different contexts. So for artificial intelligence, for example, intuition robotics, it makes LEQ, it's a companion robot for older adults. AI is definitely a part, machine learning is definitely a part of what makes LEQ work, because LEQ is a device and doesn't have context like human beings do for conversations. And so constantly it has to be learning about what does this mean and how do we create routines that are targeting that person. As they get to know a person, the device actually learns this person's habits and learns about what their interests are, and is programmed with contact information to reach out to their families and their doctors and all the rest of it. So yes, it's really important that we have learning devices, especially in areas like helping older people not be isolated and lonely. That's a really clear area. Now, Uber Health is interesting because we're part of this much larger platform, and the complexity of I was talking with one of my colleagues here yesterday, and he said, I was at the airport, I was waiting for another colleague to show up. So I spent 20 minutes waiting by the Uber area of the airport to be picked up and for my friend to come over before we would get our Uber together. And he said, in that 20 minutes, there were probably 100 rideshare vehicles, Uber vehicles coming through that place. And that's happening all over the world all the time. Hundreds of thousands and millions of rides every day around the world. So the technological sophistication, the ability to learn, the ability to adjust network capacity, all of these things are very, very important to Uber technology as a technology company. As a healthcare provider, we're still stuck with some pretty basic problems. Like, how do I know my patient's going to show up? How do I know that when they do show up that visit's going to be paid for? How do I know that when I prescribe a medicine that they're going to pick it up? Now, can I use AI to predict Mike Cantor is in a high-risk group for not taking his medicine? Therefore, we should put in special programs. We should learn things about Mike. We can coach Mike and all this stuff. Of course. But whether there's value for that, enough value for me to pay for it from a business perspective, that's really where the issue is. It's not enough to say you've got artificial intelligence and machine learning. Everyone uses those words. I'm not a computer expert or AI or machine learning expert. I know enough to know that everyone claims that, and to talk to people who actually are experts to understand what they mean. It's kind of like in healthcare, we talk about managed care. The term managed care has 50,000 different definitions depending on who you ask. And it's the same for AI and machine learning. Of course, it's very valuable and very important for the right use case under the right circumstances. But understanding what they actually can do, is it cheaper? Is it better? Is it doing things that we would not otherwise be able to do without that artificial intelligence or machine learning? Those are still questions that I think we need to explore and ask, and that a lot of skeptical medical directors and CMOs are going to ask, because we've all heard, oh, we're AI powered. Well, what does that actually mean in terms of how it makes this better for my patient, for my organization?
Right. This is great. Let me ask you one last question, which is that I hear you're headed to Israel at the end of the week. Is this business, pleasure? What's the trip?
It's a business trip. I'm actually going to the Our Crowd Summit meeting next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow. And really looking forward to seeing some of my clients and colleagues in Israel, just being in Israel, which I really, really love and enjoy. I was there last May, glad to be back less than a year later, hoping to continue to make trips, both for pleasure and tourism, but also to see colleagues and friends. And I've been lucky that as a geriatrics fellow, I ran around the world and looked at how other countries take care of older adults. And when I was in Israel a long time ago now, I made friends and colleagues with geriatricians. And so this Friday night, I'll be having Shabbat dinner with one of those folks I met in the 90s. And so it's great that Israel remains a place where I've always felt comfortable and can continue to go back to. We may have a little meetup coming up in Tel Aviv, so working on details for that for Sunday night. But I think there also, the Longevitech conference is coming up in Tel Aviv on Monday and Tuesday of next week. There's leadership conference with Our Crowd. So there's a lot happening next week in Israel. And colleagues and friends of mine from the US are also going over together. So I'll be there and get to see Israeli friends and colleagues, but also some of my American friends will be there too. And so it's going to be a great week of getting to meet lots of people and figure out if there are opportunities for further collaboration.
Amazing. That's fantastic. Well, I think I leave for Israel right when you come back, so we'll miss each other, but we know Boston. But look, this was really fantastic, Mike. Thanks so much for joining us and for taking the time to kind of share your thoughts.
Oh, you're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Let's do so. Everyone, again, you've been listening to Dr. Michael Cantor, who was the first Chief Medical Officer at Uber Health. I'm Scott Cohen from AGP Ventures. We've got a bunch of live streams coming up with more executives. We're doing a session with the head of Hyundai's robotics and R&D group, which is building like walking cars, the head of digital at the NFL, the head of store design at Amazon Fresh, which is deploying just some crazy checkout, pickup, and return technology. We're talking with the head of clinical strategy at Walmart's secret incubator called Store Number 9, and a bunch of others. In fact, our next, you should mark your calendar, March 14th, we're sitting down with Adam Shawella, who's the head of emerging technologies at Fidelity Labs. That's like the kind of software skunkworks and incubator inside Fidelity, which is like a $24 billion financial services giant. I think they've got like $4.5 trillion under management. So if you want to hear what kind of interesting companies like Fidelity are doing in the fintech and emerging tech space, you want to join us March 14th. And so to join any of these or to stay in touch, just drop us an email at access@avivgrowth.com. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, and that was it. So this concludes our live stream. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, Lee Trout.